Hi, welcome to another special live edition of Ilanomics. Today was day 5 of Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman's announcements of the stimulus package measures of the Modi government. So day 5 also happens to be 5 days when cricket test matches are played, and like our editor-in-chief Shekhar Gupta had said, the government is doing it one day by one day, and it's like a cricket test match. So today was the last day, the 5th day, and has the Indian economy won? We will find out more about that as Professor Ila Patniak will explain the implications of what has been announced today, and also the implications of the overall 5-day announcements. I will just summarize the big headlines from today. Today's focus by the finance minister was on NREGA, or Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Act. Then she spoke about some steps for health and education, what can be done for businesses during the time of COVID, decriminalization of the Companies Act, ease of doing business, public sector, enterprise matters and policy, state governments and the resources that they need to overcome this severe crisis. And towards the end, she explained how the math of the 20 lakh crore works. The NREGA got 40,000 crore extras. So there was 61,000 crores announced in the budget, and now it will be another 40,000 crores. This is a record high for NREGA. Businesses and COVID, the big headlines from there was no fresh insolvencies will be initiated for a year. MSMEs will be insulated from insolvencies by raising the threshold to 1 crore rupees from 1 lakh. So that's a huge jump. Decriminalization of Companies Act, some minor violations have been decriminalized. Ease of doing business. Actually, the finance minister was very summary. She was very crisp about ease of doing business, and she just brushed over it and said more steps will be announced later, maybe through press notes and statements of the government. The last two big headlines were for public sectors and the state governments. All sectors will be open for private sector companies. No more than 4 public sector enterprises will be there in a notified strategic sector, and non-strategic PSUs will be privatized, or stake sales will happen. And lastly, for state governments, and this was a demand of state governments that their borrowing limit should be increased from 3% of state GDP or GSDP to 5%, and the government has done that, but with some riders. So, Ila, some significant announcements, some repackaging and repeats of what have already been said. So what did you feel about today's announcements on these 7 important sectors?
I think that, like in the previous days, the announcements have basically been of 2 kinds. One, how to cope with the immediate problems caused by the lockdown, which would mean things like the bankruptcy code not applying, the company not being called a defaulter because of these few days, the announcements to do with state government finances and how they need to be allowed to borrow more during this time. And the second set of announcements, such as for public sector enterprises and what is strategic, which are reforms that have been discussed and have been on the cards for a long time. So as with all other packages, I thought today, again, we saw a similar thing. And thirdly, again, as in the previous packages, we saw an implicit assumption that people will go back to their villages and they need to be given jobs there. So the increase in MNREGA is in line with the increase that we saw for farmers' incomes, rural industries, impetus to agriculture, which basically assumes that for the next few months, maybe, people are going to be in their villages and they need income support in the villages rather than trying to keep migrant workers in the in towns, in cities. And I thought that even her tone while replying to questions was that if a state government wants migrant workers to leave, or if a state government wants migrant workers to come back to its state, then the center is willing to help. But it doesn't seem to be that the center is going to be overexcited about it and pushing that policy of keeping migrant workers either in the cities or moving them in a proactive way, or taking the initiative for that. So that seemed to be the overall tone of the announcements today as well.
So I will just ask you, questions about a couple of specific announcements Nirmala Sitharaman made today, Ila. This leeway for businesses when it comes to the IBC, Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code, that no fresh insolvencies will be initiated for a year, and MSMEs are being insulated by raising the threshold for insolvency to 1 crore from 1 lakh. And debt related to COVID will be excluded from default under IBC. The significance of this.
I think a lot of MSMEs are in huge trouble, and a lot of companies are going to be in trouble, even the bigger ones, because of the lockdown and the inability to produce, and yet having costs, whether it was already purchased raw materials, whether it is rent, whether it is salaries, wherever they have paid some salaries, management has been paid. So, even when production has not been. So there are costs that continued throughout this period. And this is a recognition perhaps of the fact that what you don't want is that almost every company in the country, or every other company in the country, is now pushed into bankruptcy. Give them some relief, give them time to recover. So for a year, they don't get into trouble. And, in some ways, bankruptcy courts and NCLT has already been overburdened by the number of cases coming, and it hasn't been easy that process hasn't particularly become very smooth till now. So it also prevents a large number of fresh new cases, thanks to this period, which wasn't, it could have been a very healthy, good company. So it wasn't the company's fault if it was asked not to produce. It's not that the company was an unproductive or a willful defaulter, or somebody who actually wanted to just, borrow and run away with the money. But it was a company that wanted to produce, but due to these circumstances, it was not able to. So that's the relief, that let's not push them into bankruptcy because of the lockdown.
The next big headline, although public sector reform has been an ongoing theme for many years now, Manmohan Singh, when he was Prime Minister, and before that, when he was Finance Minister, they started at that point of time. Prime Minister Atal Bihari Vajpayee's government did that. The Modi government has also been trying to do that. So this thing about opening all sectors to the private sector and allowing not more than 4 public sector companies to be in a notified strategic sector. They will categorize sectors as strategic and other sectors, and make sure that at least 1 public sector company is there in the strategic sector and not more than 4, and privatize non-strategic PSUs. It's a very noble statement, Ila, but do you think they will be able to do this, considering the kind of opposition this has met all along?
I mean, yesterday we saw that they announced that in space and in areas which were hitherto untouched by the private sector, they will allow private sector participation. So we might just see them allowing private sector participation in more strategic areas. Of course, it depends on now which areas will it be. Will it be railways? Will it be banks? so let's wait and see which areas they are chosen as the strategic sectors. And second, I think the important question will be, what are they going to do with the PSU? So they've said a minimum of 1 PSU and a maximum of 4 PSUs.
That's
so, if you have a lot of straight trading corporations in the space of trade, so, you have MMTC, or you have central level as well as state level trading corporations. What are they going to do with us? So we don't just have central PSUs, we also have a large number of state PSUs. So we'll have to see first what are those areas, and second, whether they then privatize the larger number. So if it's more than 4, what do you do with them? Do you try to merge them? Do you try to list them and bring in dispersed shareholding? Because you can list them and sell shares, and that's dispersed shareholding. So something like what was done with Axis Bank and HDFC. Then it was UTI and HDFC right in the beginning when they were privatized. Or do you do strategic sales, or do you do merger? So these are going to be very important details and they are going to really tell you whether these are reforms or not. Because if it's just merger, then it has a different implication. Whereas if you are allowing private participation, and if you're limiting the number of companies to 4 companies, and letting them become efficient, corporatizing them, letting them become efficient, then it actually has implications for resource allocation in the economy as a whole. So land, labor, capital goes to more productive units rather than to units which have perhaps been very unproductive for many years and have required support. So we'll have to wait and see.
Ila, the other big area was increasing the limit for states to borrow as a percentage of their state GDP from 3% to 5% with a lot of riders. The states have been demanding this. It's an emergency, it's a crisis situation. But the riders, it comes with a rider that from 3 to 3.5%, it's unconditional. The next 1% will be in tranches linked to clearly specified, measurable, feasible reform. And the last 0.5% will be if milestones are met in 3 of the 4 reform areas. So center is laying out some very clear rules for states, to increase their borrowings and make sure that they are spent well. What do you think of this?
I think really, ultimately, it will depend on how the pandemic plays out. It's not as if the pandemic is over. It's not as if no new cases are coming in. It's not even as if new cases coming in are less, and so we've peaked. No, we haven't really peaked so far. So yes, today they might be putting a number of conditions, but tomorrow, if there are more lockdowns required in industrial belts or lockdowns required in places from where states earn their resources, we'll need to see how these might need to get amended, how these conditions might need to get amended. At the moment, I think because Finance Minister said that only 14% of those borrowing limits have actually been used by states. So at the moment, it seems that yes, if you do want to borrow more, we can put conditions. If that condition changes, if states have already used up 100%, are not able to meet the conditions that have been put, then my hunch is that these norms will be changed. They're not binding today, and they're an attempt to push states to do reforms and to be prudent. But the pandemic situation, even now, is unsolved, unresolved, and we'll have to wait and see how it plays out.
So these were the big headlines, Ila, and we will try and capture the sense of what we saw in the last 5 days. I'll try and quote what the finance minister and the Minister of State for Finance, Anurag Thakur, talked about today. They said the whole idea has been about constructive, productive, target-focused reforms to strengthen the economy. Anurag Thakur said, "Sankat mein avsar," as in, we are looking for an opportunity in a crisis. And they also, you could have, you saw the Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman talk about the breakup of the 20 lakh crore, because everybody has been asking questions about where will this 20 lakh crore come from, or can you give us a breakup? And she gave a breakup and she was smiling, and you could see that, look, I'm giving you the breakup. You guys thought, we are just fooling you with some numbers here and there. And then when she was asked about the fiscal deficit and what this will do to the fiscal deficit, she said, we will talk about the fiscal deficit later. So how do you capture what the government has done in the last 5 days after the Prime Minister announced that big 20 lakh crore package? How much of this is a package? How much of this is a repackage?
YP, I'll have to sit with the numbers and to see what exactly is the increased fiscal outgo this year. As we have discussed earlier, there is very little space to borrow, not simply because you're trying to meet an FRBM target or something, but mainly because your tax revenue has fallen and will fall during this year. So even if you did not do additional borrowing, additional spending, I'm sorry, if you were not doing additional spending, then also you would have to have had to borrow more. So, the 12 lakh crore that was announced as this year's borrowing program, my sense is that's not going to be sufficient because of the slowdown in the economy not having fully taken into account. So I think the math is going to be very difficult. I don't think the government has a lot of appetite to borrow a lot from abroad, which means that the borrowing has to come domestically. And domestic borrowing mainly comes either through small savings, provident funds, and so on, which are not going to go up, national savings certificate, provident funds, or it comes through government bonds, which a lot of banks and financial institutions buy because we deposit money with them and then they go ahead and buy government bonds. And the third source is, of course, printing money. So I was looking at the RBI balance sheet from the weekly statistical supplement in terms of looking at, if there appears to be hints of additional printing of money. And there does seem to be at the moment, at least the last WSS I looked at of last week, that yes, there is an increase in RBI's balance sheet and more on the domestic bonds. But, before jumping to any conclusions, I think need to look at the numbers more carefully and maybe write a column on that after
Oh,
looking at
yes.
the details.
Yeah. Talking about a column, I want to tell our viewers that you should await Ila's analysis of what has been announced today. We will have it very soon, probably as soon as tomorrow, if possible. And also, there is another column that has gone up on the print.in website. It is by our opinion editor Rama Lakshmi. She has talked about how India goes for big bang reforms only when there is a crisis. And even Prime Minister Narendra Modi had to wait for such a crisis to announce such reforms. It has just been published less than half an hour back, so please read this very insightful column opinion by our opinion editor Rama Lakshmi. Okay, Ila, let's start taking questions. I have questions on both on the YouTube stream as well as Twitter. The first question we've got from on YouTube is by Pratik Panchal. He's asking us, how can the center coerce states to reform, and how will it work when they're already not borrowing from the center? Is India, I guess he means the central government, playing an IMF when it comes to ensuring states reform?
The Finance Commission, starting with the 12th Finance Commission, had started this trend, I should say, of saying that, yes, you can borrow. Your borrowing depends on the reforms you do. You can get 3%, when FRBM targets were put in for states as well. And there were many things that were linked to reforms. So things like JNURM and the funds you got under JNURM would be linked to the reforms they do. That trend was started by finance commissions, primarily because state governments would have very large deficits and would not, we saw a period when the state government debt started rising much faster than the central government debt. Things such as discoms, who state electricity boards that were having T&D losses of up 40 to 50%, which was more of, call it leakage sometimes, political largesse at other times. And those kind of reforms that you need to reform these so as to be able to borrow were put in place, and attempts have been made to bring state government debt online so that it doesn't explode exponentially. My sense of today is that, yes, a similar thing is being tried because there isn't a lot of money. And as we said, whatever the government borrows, so the central plus state governments, whatever they borrow has to come from somebody's savings. The borrowing doesn't come from, yes, a little, as I said, a little bit of printing money, a little bit of borrowing from abroad, but mainly it has to come from somebody's savings. So we don't want too much borrowing. So you want to put some restrictions. You also want some reforms, such as of the state electricity boards. So my sense is that's what is being attempted.
I will take a question from Twitter now, Ila. This is a handle, doesn't have a full name. It says MSR_LOLOL. Two questions. First one is, why do you think the government is hesitant to put money in bank accounts? Is it because of inflation? I think this is something we've talked about, but people continue to keep asking this question. And I'll ask the second one. Why is NREGA not being linked to agriculture as requested by some states such as Telangana? What are its implications?
Okay, so the first is, of course, I don't think inflation is a problem. I think under most cases, when demand is depressed, you don't get high inflation, you don't get high inflationary expectations. However, there may still be some supply issues, and then you might get supply side inflation, but usually that is short term and that is linked to specific commodities. So I don't think that it's about the amount of inflation. I think it's got more to do with we are not going to be able to sustain large transfers of money. Yes, they could have given more. They could have given, 500 rupees more. And if that was another 18,000 crores, then it's not all that much. Perhaps they will, because it depends on how bad things are. But I don't think inflation is the reason why that is not being done. More maybe fiscal constraints and trying to revive industry. So, if by spending the same amount, say spending 10,000 crores in reviving industry, you get more jobs and more incomes than if you directly transfer the money, perhaps that's what's being tried. And then also they're trying to give food directly, because there is a lot of food. We have excess food grains in our coffers, and we could, we don't have money, but we have food grain. So you try and give food grain rather than money. So maybe that's what's being tried. YP, what was the second question?
The second question, Ila, was about linking NREGA to agriculture, as some states have demanded, such as Telangana. And what is the implication of linking NREGA to agriculture?
I'm not aware of what Telangana has
demanded.
Demanded. So I don't know if I'll be able to correctly answer this question, but on a broader sense, one of the things that has been demanded in the past is that why not get harvesting done? Why not get sowing done? Now that would basically mean that the farmer then utilizes those resources rather than employing people himself, but he utilizes NREGA funds to do harvesting and sowing, right? Now, if from what I'm aware, that is what we're talking about. Do you think that's right?
I think so.
Yeah. Now the question then would be that the demand for NREGA in terms of what the farmers, what agriculture would require, would maybe become far beyond what you can pay for. Okay, that could be one question. And secondly, then it won't, NREGA wouldn't be uh, an anti-poverty program. So what it was intended to be was a self-targeting unemployment, cyclical sort of program, which means that when in those periods when the business cycle, or when, like look at the present conditions, COVID conditions, that at that time when people have lost their jobs, then those who are willing to, almost the Keynesian, dig holes and fill them up, will be those who can get no other work. Now, you don't want to turn NREGA into the employment program for all agricultural activities. So what you want to do is those who don't have jobs, those who don't get employment in agriculture, those don't get those you know harvesting, sowing sort of activities, they are the ones who are then given some work, and this work is like a workfare program, so that it, otherwise NREGA amounts will increase endlessly, and the government will then have to sustain almost all agricultural activities. So the design of a workfare program, which was NREGA, was very different. It's supposed to be a self-targeted, at the time when things are bad, you spend more and you pay people more. So my sense is that logic still continues, though I must admit that I don't know what Telangana has asked for and why the government is saying no to those recommendations.
The next question is from Twitter from Wagesh Mahajan. And I think you will have to pick up that crystal ball in your shelf behind you and gaze at it, Ila. He's asking us, what do you think will be the GDP growth this year and the next financial year?
My estimate for GDP growth this year, that we had talked about 5 or 6 episodes, maybe 7, 8 episodes ago. 7, 8, that means about 7, 8 weeks ago, when the lockdown started, was a baseline scenario of 0%. And that is when others were talking about 3%, 2% growth. And it was 0% based on a very simple calculation. And if, as the lockdown has continued, I think you can use this calculation to make a estimate yourself. So let me just give you the basis of that calculation rather than to give numbers, because the numbers will change as the lockdown continues. Suppose you stop all work for a month, you would lose a month's GDP. Let's say you stop half the work, so you continue with many things, you lose half of that month's GDP. If you stop work for 2 months, then that's or 50, be at 50% for 2 months, then you're really at a loss of 1 month of GDP in that year fully. Okay, so I'm not even we can talk about what happens to firms who are then going to be facing losses and so on, but let's just go with a very, very crude back of the envelope calculation of the minimum loss of GDP is production of goods and services, so of the value added in that period. So one 12th would be lost if in these 2 months you were at 50% capacity. That's about what, 8%? And so GDP would be lower by 8%. We're talking of contraction of GDP. So in the full year, if you were in a lockdown for 2 months, and in those 2 months, you were just producing 50%. So we've pretty much seen that. Yes, that we have had about 2 months of lockdown. And in fact, 50% might be an overestimate. But if that is the case, then, and let's just assume that by magic, which won't happen, that by magic, you were going to produce what you were, earlier producing. You bounced back. Somehow you got all the liquidity, you got the working capital, and you bounced back immediately. Then the rest of the year, you produce what you were producing last year. Then you would still have had a contraction in GDP of a loss of equal to 1/12 of GDP. So the calculation of how to think about what is going to happen during the year will depend on how long the lockdown is. And that depends on, maybe not the full lockdown, but even parts of it, even factories that are not able to function, or cities or markets and so on that are not able to function. And my sense today is that this year, we are not going to be back to normal. We might be a little below normal, but we're not going to be back to normal. So my estimates are of a contraction, but how much really depend on how long the lockdown is and how well we control the disease. So it's about coronavirus, it's about the health.
I just want to remind our viewers that last week, about 10 days back, Nomura, this Japanese financial services company, had the Nomura analyst in India had forecast a contraction of 5%. That is minus 5%. That's a very, very huge and shocking number. And let us hope that we don't go that low. Just an additional question from Vagesh on Twitter. Ila, he's asking us, from all that has been announced now, do you think the government has done enough to kickstart demand once the lockdown ends and the economy reopens?
I think it's going to be hard. Kickstarting demand is going to be very hard. And yes, some things have been done, and industry would like to see more, but I worry that to some extent, of course, it will bring the economy back. Measures have been given, banks are going to give credit, there's 100% guarantee, so some companies will be able to cobble together. But I doubt that we'll be able to come back to exactly where we were. So even my 0% scenario, I doubt that we'll be able to come back to where we were.
Mm-hmm. A couple more questions from viewers on YouTube and WhatsApp. Ayush is sending us, Ila. We already have crossed 32 minutes, so we'll have to start winding up because it's a Sunday afternoon and people will want to go back to their Sundays. Ashish Upadhyay asks us, are these reforms and policies enough to make India a manufacturing hub? This conversation has been going on that, China is not so dependable now, or the world thinks we cannot depend on China. We need to move our manufacturing to different parts of the world. Maybe India is a good place to do that because it's got a huge working age population and the potential. So do you think that can happen now?
I think with the steps taken, we might free up our agriculture much more with the steps taken and the steps promised. And that would be a great thing for manufacturing and becoming a manufacturing hub. I'm not even sure that that is very feasible, to begin with, given that China already has marched ahead and has an advantage, and actually is even removing the lockdown before us because they've peaked. But apart from that, I think we need tax reform, tax policy reform, tax administration reform. We need financial sector reform. We need much more infrastructure. We need things that even as a economy, a new economy that it wants to go and become a country that wants to become a global power and has aspirations to go abroad. We need far more liberalization of some of the capital account restrictions that we have, particularly in terms of the red tapeism that companies have to face. And unfortunately, those issues have not been addressed in this package, at least. We are seeing last 10 years, you see a lot of companies have headquarters in Singapore or have moved abroad because of the difficulties with the RBI's capital control regimes and with the tax administration. And my sense is that without removing those, we will not become the global manufacturing hub or supply chain that parts that we have been talking about.
Uh, I'll combine two questions, two similar questions. Ila, the first one is from Surendra Parsode. I hope I'm pronouncing that right, please. And the second question is from Abhijit Gulve. Abhijit is asking us if all the 5 tranches are put together, the 5 days of announcements. This was something similar that was asked yesterday. Would you compare these to the 1991 reforms? And the second question is, what is pending now? What else is left to make our ease of doing business better?
Okay, at the risk of being repetitive, uh, I would say that 1991 reforms freed up the licensing and the restrictions that we had in industry and in imports. What we've seen in this package are a promise to remove restrictions in a similar fashion on agriculture. The 3 laws the 3 central laws that Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman has promised to bring in, which will one bring an amendment to the Essential Commodities Act. Second, change the Contracts Act. And third, remove restrictions on interstate barriers to trade, thereby creating a national market. That element of these 5 tranches and this total package is what compares to what was done to industry in 1991. The difference here is that it's not something that has happened already. It is a promise. And I think Shekhar Gupta talked about this in Cut the Clutter, that we are all going to be waiting anxiously to see that those promises are kept, because that is that one element of reform where you're going to say the farmer is now free to market what he produces. He's free to sell what he produces, and that completely changes his incentives for what he does. And apart from that, I think what more needs to be done, I just talked about reforms in taxation and reforms in capital controls, banking reforms, financial sector reforms that haven't been done and that need to be done if we are going to grow faster and become an economic power.
I think we'll wind up now, Ila, because we've already come nearly 40 minutes into the live episode. I will just summarize some of the questions that are still pending, and we'll talk about the answers you gave. Umang Srivastava has asked us, is the government planning to privatize public sector banks and railways? We don't know. You already talked about that. There is merger of public sector banks that has been going on. You have talked about giving more licenses to private sector, new private players in the banking sector. So that is an ongoing, process there. And the rest, most of the other questions about liberalization of agriculture, we have discussed yesterday. Anurima Ruhel is asking that question. Anurima, you should go back to our live recordings, which are there on our YouTube channel, and watch them there. We had a specific one on agriculture. Roman Slays asked us, how has the overall package been? Is it sufficient or insufficient? That has also been discussed. Uh, it's been a long 5 day test match for the economy, Ila. But the proof of the pudding will now come after the 5 days, and we will keep tracking it regularly, and we will come back to you with more live episodes and recorded episodes of Ilanomics. And also, please do read Ila's columns on the print.in. She will have one hopefully tomorrow, as early as tomorrow, on what has been announced in the last 5 days. That will be more elaborate with more details and insights, because when we talk to you immediately after the finance minister's press conference, we don't know the fine print. So that will be analyzed in Ila's columns. Thank you for watching and supporting us. Please do continue to track us and subscribe to our YouTube channel and watch our other videos also. Thanks again from me, YP Rajesh.